Hello, my name is Rasmus Nielsen. I'm director of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and professor of political communication at the University of Oxford. I'm delighted to be here for this launch event in partnership with Newslaundry, where I will present some key findings from the 2021 Reuters Institute Digital News Report, which includes, for the first time in the main report, India this year, and then to discuss some of the key findings with Manisha and a panel of esteemed practitioners from India. The Reuters Institute Digital News Report is the world's largest ongoing study of how people across the world use news and media and how they think about news and media. This year, the report covers 6 markets all over the globe that combined account for more than half the world's population. I'm very glad that this year we were able to include India in the report for the first time. Though I should recognize here that we are at this stage only surveying people in India who have access to the internet and are comfortable answering the questions in either English or in Hindi. So this represents a small but important part of the Indian media market, but of course not the entirety of the Indian public and the many different ways in which different part of India uses news and media. The study in general is based on an online survey. So in every country we're in the field, it will underrepresent the habits of less affluent people, people in marginalized communities, and people in parts of the country that may not have great connectivity yet. This is, of course, particularly important in countries with limited internet access. I should also thank the sponsors who make the project possible, including 15 different funders, including the Google News Initiative, which supported the inclusion of India this year, as well as media organizations such as the BBC, media regulators, foundations, and universities in different parts of the world, as well as our country partners, including in India, the Asian College of Journalism, thank you, Shashi, that helps us design the study and interpret the findings in the different markets that we cover. What I want to do today is to run through just a few key findings, some of them global and some of them specific to India, and then I really look forward to the conversation with our great panelists today. And where I wanted to start is really with the pandemic, which has been particularly rough in India this spring and summer, of course, and start with what our data can tell us about how that pandemic has influenced the way in which people use and think about news in different parts of the world. And one thing we see very clearly in many countries is that the pandemic has reminded people of the importance of credible, accurate information from trusted sources. We've seen for the first time in some years an actual increase in the percentage of people who say they trust most news most of the time. There's been no similar change in people's trust in news that they access on platforms, for example, social media, which means that the trust gap between news in general and news accessed on social media has increased as more people in many countries say they trust most news most of the time. However, the pattern here is not entirely universal, as one would expect with such a large and complex study as ours. There are many countries in which we've seen very significant increases in trust, some of them 10 percentage points or more, but it's not entirely clear that every country has seen this development. So, for example, in India, where we can compare to our pilot study in 2019, there's been no significant change in the headline figure for trust in news in India. And when we look more closely at the different key trust questions we have in the study every year and compare India 2019 with the 2021 study, there's been a small increase in trust in news overall and a much bigger increase in people saying that they trust the news they themselves personally use, normally an indication of divided societies where people may not trust the media in general, but trust the media that they consider sort of their own. And as we've seen globally, no significant changes really in trust in news found by search engines or social media, which means that in India, the trust gap is much smaller than it is across the countries that we cover. And really, there is, in particular, when it comes to search, no significant trust gap between platforms and news providers in India. Now, of course, the questions about trust in news I use highlight the importance of individual brands. Every year in the survey, we ask a question where we ask people to scale how trustworthy they find individual brands on a scale from 0 to 10. We can categorize those who trust, those who land in the middle, and those who actively distrust individual brands. And the pattern we find in India is quite similar to what we've seen in many other countries, which is one in which the most widely used brands are often also the most widely trusted. including both commercial newspapers with a very large reach, as well as broadcasters and upmarket newspapers that sometimes have a somewhat lower reach, but is often read through the lens of the prestige that's associated with them, and sort of a certain aspirational interpretation of their standing. What we also find is that digital-born entrants that people are less familiar with are often less trusted, even in cases where their journalism may well be excellent. This is a pattern we see in country after country. And finally, that very polarized and partisan brands, sometimes cable television channels and the like, are generally less trusted. So this pattern we see very clearly in India, but it's also one we recognize in parts of Europe, such as France, for example, where again, sort of centrist newspapers are highly trusted. Many broadcasters are highly trusted, whereas new entrants, like in France, HuffPost, and polarizing television channels like BFM TV News are much less trusted. Trust matters, of course, in part of for the role that journalism can play in informing the public and helping people make better decisions and navigate their lives, whether during the pandemic or more broadly. But it probably also matters in other ways that are a bit more close to the business of news. So what we've seen across the world this year is that if we compare the online reach of brands last year in 2020 with their online reach in 2021, those that are more highly trusted have often done better in terms of their increase in their online reach. We don't have this data for India, unfortunately, and the pattern isn't sort of entirely linear, if you will, but there is a correlation between with more trusted brands generally doing better in terms of not just growing their audience, as many did during the crisis, but also retaining some of the growth that they've had as people settle in some countries in a lull between waves of COVID. Now, the backdrop here, of course, is also a darker one of concerns over misinformation. We find again this year, as we've done before, that there are very high levels of public concern over whether the news that people see online is fake or real. When we ask people about the different sort of topics they see misinformation about, we now have as high levels of concern over misinformation about COVID-19 as we do about politics, which has been the main focus in the past. This is data specifically from India. Though there are many other issues where people also say that they see different kinds of misinformation, whether it's things that might be commercially motivated, sort of rumors or celebrities who may have died or something terrible have happened to them that drives people to sort of clickbait sites of various sorts, or misinformation about other issues such as climate change, medicine, or the like. When we ask people to identify the sources of false or misleading information they're most concerned about, the pattern we see in India is pretty similar to what we see in most other countries, which is that much of the focus is on the behavior of politicians. Nearly a quarter of our respondents in India say they're most concerned about the behavior of politicians when it comes to spreading false and misleading information. There's also a real concern about ordinary people, the sort of proverbial uncle spreading false and misleading information in various platforms. But I think it's noteworthy to see that while there seems to be some concern from some political quarters about activists and journalists as possible disseminators of false and misleading information, this is not a concern that's shared by the public, at least amongst our English language internet using respondents. Now, turning from sources to platforms, we also ask people about what platforms they're most concerned about coming across false and misleading information from. India is one of the markets in which much of the focus here is on WhatsApp. 28% of our respondents in India identify messaging applications, primarily WhatsApp, as the platform they're most concerned about. And then high levels of concern also about Facebook and the Google-owned YouTube. If we look across the world, focus is normally in most countries on either WhatsApp, as in many countries in the global south, or on Facebook. And across the 46 markets we covered this year, really in most countries, the concern essentially is focused on what we might think of as sort of Facebook corporate, if you will. And 43% of our respondents identify either Facebook or WhatsApp as the platform they're most concerned about. Now, against this sort of dark backdrop of concern over misinformation from politicians found on platforms and on many different topics, and with the patterns that we've seen around trust, I think many in the industry, in addition to their editorial considerations, were thinking about what commercial opportunities might lie in this information disorder and the developments we see around trust. Here, I think the findings are sort of somewhat encouraging, but still incipient. So we do see some markets in which we've seen significant growth over the longer term in terms of the percentage of people who say they're willing to pay for news or already are paying for online news. In the United States, in the last 5 years, we've seen more than a doubling in the percentage of people who say that they're paying for online news. There are other markets too in Europe that are seeing some growth and quite high levels of pay in Nordic countries. But it's also, I think, important to recognize that there are a number of markets in which we've seen little or no top-line progress, even if individual brands are doing well. In France, in Germany, and the UK, there's been no significant overall change in the total number of people who say they're paying for online news, even if some brands are doing well. And I think we can intuitively understand why. If we look at what some of the people who join our focus groups say, people generally feel that news is abundant. It's freely accessible, literally everywhere, as one young woman in the UK focus group says. And she doesn't really see any need to pay for it. Just as an older man from Germany in one of our focus groups feels that he can get all the information that he needs with the aggregator that's built into his phone. So he doesn't really see any need for a subscription. This creates a challenging market, as anyone who works on the business side knows, where we see very strong winner-takes-most dynamics in most markets. So we identify the brands that people say they pay to access in different markets. And in country after country, the pattern is clear. It's a limited number of often upmarket national brands who account for a large share of the subscriptions, often half or even more of all who say they pay for online news are paying to access for just a few large national brands. And then there is significant variation in how well local titles do, which historically, of course, has often been the structure, the main structure of news provision in the business of news has often been local and regional. But we're in many countries not seeing the same dynamic in the business of online news, which tends to be dominated by national players, with some variations. In Norway, a significant number of people say they're paying to access local news. In the UK, the figure is very, very low. Just 3% of those who say they pay for online news are paying for local titles. And in the US, there is some progress at the local level, with now almost a quarter of the people who pay for online news saying they pay for local titles. And this year, for the first time, we have a single country of those where we study pay in depth, namely the United States, where the median number of subscriptions have inched above one. In almost every other country, people at most pay for one in terms of large numbers of people. But this year, for the first time in the US, the median number of subscriptions is two, often a big national title, and then either a local supplement or a niche supplement on top of what people are paying for from the big national titles. If we want to understand the motivations, we can look at some of the open-ended responses we have to our questions in different countries. In some cases, this is about the people's strong belief in the values they see behind journalism in general, or behind individual brands, as illustrated by this quote from a man from the United States. In some cases, people are simply convinced in a more transactional sense by an offer. This is an example from Sweden, where a woman was offered a subscription at a nominal price and took it on top of her local paper to try out something new online. We have people who say they actively seek different perspectives to supplement the news that's available abundantly for free online. A man here from the US who explains that he, in addition to reading the Wall Street Journal, is subscribing to The Athletic for in-depth coverage of sport, and the National Review, a conservative opinion magazine and website. And finally, of course, breadth and diversity. There are people who are subscribing either to individual titles or aggregators of both, because they want depth and breadth and perspective, in addition to sort of the clear values behind some of the organizations that they might subscribe to. Now, it seems to me that this is sort of one of the things that both the profession and industry is working through, as to how to find the balance between the commitment to sort of breadth and diversity of perspectives versus the very real public desire also for journalism that is clearer about its values and sometimes takes a stance on big issues of the day. We've tried to get better data on the public perception on these issues that we broadly can think of as associated with issues of impartiality, though of course that can be practiced in many different ways. And here again, I'll share the results just for India in terms of public perception of how people think the news organization should approach some of these issues. And what we find in India is that people say that they really want a range of different views and actually express quite a high level of commitment to fairly conventional ideals of impartial and objective news reporting, with 61% of our respondents saying that they believe that news outlets should reflect a range of different views and leave it up to people to make up their own mind and decide on the big issues of the day, with a significant minority, but still only about a quarter, saying that they believe that news outlets should actively argue for the views that they think are best. We can also see this in a sort of somewhat different way in that there might still be some issues where people appreciate news organizations taking a clearer stance. So when we ask follow-up questions about whether people believe that news outlets should be neutral on every issue, which 49% of our respondents in India say, there's also a much, much larger minority of 40%, so nearly half, who say that there are some issues where they believe it makes no sense for news outlets to try to be neutral. So I think here a more nuanced understanding from much of the public who may want what can be derided as he said, she said journalism and sort of centrist on the one hand, on the other hand, reporting on many different issues, but also recognize that there might be some issues, whether it's around fundamental rights or minority protection, climate change, or other polarizing and high stakes issue facing our societies, where they actually want news organizations, journalists to take a clearer stand and explain that stand and stand by it. Finally, when we ask people about how they think that newsrooms should allocate time and what voices they should feature, again, quite a strong commitment to fairly conventional notions of journalistic values. 61% of the public say that they believe that news outlets should give equal time to all sides. And again, a significant minority, but still less than a third, who believe that news outlets should give less time to sides they think have a weaker argument. So I think here a complex picture with a pretty strong public support for the idea that reporters should sort of cover a range of different views and give time to a range of different voices on most issues, but also a large minority who believe that news organizations can and probably should take a stance on some of the big issues that matter, even if they don't want to take a stance on every issue necessarily. Finally, I want to talk about gateways in social media because, of course, people can sort of see quite a lot of voices that take a very clear stance on social media, amongst other things, and will encounter their news brands, but in a context where they also come across other ordinary citizens as well as various other voices that loom quite large in different markets. And really what we're seeing in most of the world is a continued move from direct discovery, where people go direct to news sites or apps for their news, to what we call distributed discovery, where social media, search engines, and aggregators and other site-source forms of access loom very large. So this year, amongst all our respondents, it's just a quarter who say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of accessing news online. And nearly 3/4 who rely on various forms of site-door access. And this is much more pronounced among younger people, where less than a fifth say they go direct to news sites and apps. In India, in many ways, at least for our English language internet using respondents, I think here is much further in the development towards an environment more dominated by distributed discovery than some of the markets we see in Northern Europe, for example, where publishers still have very strong direct connections with much of the public. So looking specifically at the India data, we find that just 12% of our respondents say that going direct to a news site or app is their main way of accessing news online, and much, much greater reliance on social and search aggregators of various sorts, and even slightly more pronounced amongst the under 35s, though, of course, at this level, it becomes difficult to see much of a difference between the generations, given how relatively few, only a little more than 1 in 10, say that direct access is their main form of access. What we're seeing more widely, globally, is an increasingly complex platform ecology, where Facebook is still incredibly important overall, but the company's slew of decisions from 2016 onwards in particular to reduce the role of news in the newsfeed and move news into discrete products such as Facebook News seem to have reduced the percentage of people who say they get news while using Facebook. We've seen no similar decline in the overall use of Facebook, only specifically for people getting news on Facebook, even as other platforms are becoming more important, whether they are long-established ones such as Twitter and YouTube, or newer entrants, at least newer in some markets, WhatsApp, Instagram, and more youth-oriented and visually oriented tech networks like Snapchat and TikTok. Now, finally, in terms of how people navigate information, this more complex platform ecology, we ask people a set of questions about what their main motivations are when they come across news on different platforms, and we sort of break this down in different types. And I think the pattern we see here is an interesting one in the sense that it's really only when we look across all the 46 markets that we cover this year, it's really only Twitter where getting the very latest news is a central motivation for people and their core motivation for using a particular platform for news. Most of the platforms we look at here, YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok, people identify entertainment as the main motivation for why they come across news in a particular platform. And then finally, Facebook, by far the most commonly named motivation is that people see news on Facebook while they're there for other reasons, presumably social reasons, to follow people that they care about or maybe once cared about in their lives, and in the process, incidentally, come across news while they are on the platform. Finally, in terms of what voices people pay attention to in these different environments, there too, I think we begin to see quite a finely differentiated ecology here. And we ask people essentially a question of when they get news in different platforms, who do they generally pay the most attention to? And again, I think there are some really interesting differences here across different platforms. So we do have Twitter, where people say they pay attention to mainstream news and mainstream journalists. This is the most commonly named source of information people say they pay attention to when it comes to news on Twitter. As well as sort of an older network like Facebook, where mainstream news and ordinary people, so other people sharing news, are the two types of sources people most frequently name. Then we quickly sort of get into entertainment territory. Mainstream news still important on YouTube, but personalities loom large there. So creators, influencers, individual voices of various sorts. And then when we get to the newer, more visually led networks, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok, on all of these, by far the most commonly named type of voice or profile that people say they pay attention to around news are personalities. Individual celebrities, content creators, influencers of various sorts. So quite a different, if you will, way of navigating news online than that we associate with older networks like Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and of course, very, very different from going direct to a news site or app. So finally, a couple of questions just from my side, but really I want to hear your questions and your thoughts on this research and how it speaks to your experiences. It's clear that COVID-19 has accelerated digital change as people have been sort of cut off from print, for example, and advertisers have rethought their investments. This benefits a few winners, most prominently, of course, the large platform companies, but also some news brands that seem to be doing well out of the crisis. And it clearly has put further pressure on traditional funding models, in particular print, but also digital advertising, which tend to go to Google and Facebook. There is a question here, I think, about how news media can build on the trust premium that some seem to have gained during the pandemic, as people were sort of reminded of the value of independent, credible, and trustworthy information. I think there are some questions about how far pay models can go globally, but in particular, of course, in India, where the reference price has been very low historically, and many people for many years have accessed most of their news for free or for a very, very low price in print and broadcast as well. And of course, a question of how journalists and the news industry in those countries where pay is doing better can serve those who are not prepared to pay, and what funding models can enable that. Then I think we have a set of questions about the balance between impartiality and moral clarity in divided societies, where I think the public has quite nuanced views, but it's also clear that it's difficult for editors and journalists to find their feet in these often very divisive debates. And strike a balance between the idea of impartiality with the idea of greater moral clarity. And finally, in many markets, I think there is a very real challenge around how news media and journalists can engage younger audiences who seem to prefer social media and other platforms and often follow individual creators rather than the brands that my generation and previous generations have grown up with. So with that, thank you very much. And I will hand it over here to Manisha from Newslaundry, who will expertly chair and steer the conversation. And I look forward to learning more from all of you.
Thank you so much, Rasmus. That was really good and some really interesting points for us to discuss here. So I'm just going to jump right in, but I just want to introduce our panel. First, we have Dhanya Rajendran with us. She's the editor-in-chief at News Minute. It's a very well-loved South India-focused news website that's done some brilliant work during the pandemic. We have Supriya Sharma with us. She's executive editor at Scroll, that again has done some brilliant investigations during the second wave, whether on oxygen shortage or on foreign aid that had been coming to India. And we have with us Shashi Kumar, who has founded and chairs the Media Development Foundation, which administers the Asian College of Journalism. It's the go-to place for many aspiring journalists, and he's also a media entrepreneur and a journalist. Now, actually, I just want to start with one of the points you made later on in your presentation, which really I'm very interested in, which is the concept of neutrality, where you say that about 40% majority of news consumers from your respondents still want the media to be neutral. And a few of them, a significant less amount, feel that, okay, not every issue can have, two sides. So for example, if there's a rape story or if there's a crime story, you can't be advocating for the rapist or the murderer. I'm guessing that's what they mean by saying that some stories can't have two sides. Now, I'll start with Dhanya and then maybe come to Supriya and then we can go to Shashi. Dhanya, neutrality is a word thrown at a lot of us as journalists in a hyper-partisan media space like we have in India and a hyper-polarized space. It's often thrown at you from all sides, where you're accused of not being neutral enough. All journalists face this. And so I just want your thoughts on that. When a news consumer comes to you and says, or, tweets to you or writes to you saying, hey, can News Minute be more neutral? Or can you be more neutral? What is it that they're expecting out of you? And how do you view, the issue of moral clarity and balancing it with impartiality?
See, I think first, at least in my personal view, what journalists, organizations, and news consumers should understand is that neutrality does not exist. It does not exist simply because we are human beings who do stories. And I think we should not aspire to be neutral. See, from the selection of story, right? The bias works from the very selection of story. If I have 3 stories in front of me and I can do all 3, which one do I choose to do that day? From there starts my inherent bias and then how I write it. Now, I think what news consumers can definitely demand is that sometimes certain stories, the journalist should make an effort to get both sides of the story. I think even what we were taught many years ago, that if there's a story, get A's version, B's version, and just put it across. That also doesn't work for a lot of stories these days because A and B's version are not the same. Maybe B's version has to be questioned and A's need not. So these are things which journalists have to think about, right? Many people really simplify news as put A's or B's and C's version and that's it, leave it at that. That's not really neutrality. And I don't think that news consumers should expect that. I was actually looking through all the charts and feeling a bit concerned when the chart said that almost 40% of people in India believe the news media, because if you look at most mainstream media in India, and 40% of people actually believe them, especially if this includes television, I find that very worrying. Sorry, Manisha.
Supriya, do you want to come in? When a news consumer demands neutrality out of Scroll, what do you think is the implication mostly?
I think a lot of news consumers also do understand that the mission of journalism is to hold power to account. And so there isn't really some symmetry out there in society. And so to put, official sources at the same, to demand the same accountability from an ordinary citizen as we do of the government is really doesn't make any sense. We are going to ask tougher questions of the government. And I'm also puzzled really by what the news consumer thinks of impartiality. As a journalist, what I think of it is fairness, which is give space to every view, give a chance to every side of the story to present their stance on it. But at the same time, I don't think this is a question of symmetry. I think we will, as journalists, hold power to account, which means we will ask tougher questions of the government. And I also do think that that's a traditional value of journalism that news consumers do expect.
Shashi, do you want to come in?
Yes, I'd say that neutrality is, as a clinical kind of quantum, makes no sense. But there is, I think, value in looking at objectivity, which might be a different idea. But the way it's panning out, I think there are two kinds of objectivities possible. One is, of course, to be fair-minded, as Supriya said, to be equitable in terms of your story, to give the other person his viewpoint as well. But it's also possible that in a highly fragmented media ecology that we are in now, your neutrality or sense of objectivity will come through a collision of various viewpoints. So it's not necessary that a single media outlet or organization or platform gives all of these viewpoints. I advocate a particular point of view. Another organization or vehicle advocates an opposite point of view. And if I'm able to get a sampling of each of these, I then work my way through that and arrive at some kind of golden mean of what might be happening out there. So I think that's what is really happening, which is why, and I think in the current ecology, we can argue about this till the cows come home, but the fact of the matter is it's fragmented, it's filter bubble, it's echo chamber, and I suspect the mainstream media is also being tempted into it and drawn into it because that's where the eyeballs are and that's where the viewership is and that's where the TRPs are.
Manisha, I want to just quickly add a point. You started by saying that perhaps it's news about rape or some sort of sexual attack where people don't expect different versions. In fact, in India, we've seen the opposite. We have seen that it is when such crimes happen, in the Hathras rape and what happened in Kashmir, that's when people are more polarized.
Yeah.
And they don't want versions. They want their version to be out there. It's either my way or the highway for most people, especially when it comes to crime news recently, and it has some sort of political, caste or religious tones to it. So I think people expecting neutrality is at different levels. And I agree with what both Supriya and Mr. Shashi Kumar said, that we need to be objective. We need to give all sides, but we cannot always be told that give both sides equal footing. That's about it.
I think it's interesting you brought the Hathras case. This was a gang rape case that had occurred in Uttar Pradesh. And I think there, some of the, feedback you'd get, which is seemingly to demand neutrality. But the question is, hey, why are you talking about a rape in this state? Why aren't you talking about a state, another state which is not governed by the BJP where a rape has happened? So kind of saying that, hey, balance all crimes. But I just, this brings me neatly to the point that Rasmus made also about trusting in a source that you've chosen. In India, that seems to be a high percentage of people who've chosen a brand. So they may not trust news overall, but they trust the brand that they have chosen. And that, you say, is an indication of a hyperpolarized kind of a news space. And my question is then that journalists perceive themselves as, truth seekers, as, people who are holding power to account. But if our audience is going to not believe us or not look at us as a neutral source, or if our audience is just going to choose their version from, the various versions out there, what does it do to journalism then?
Can I come in on this very quickly? In the report, in the Reuters report, for instance, one of the apparent contradictions that I find, which is interesting, it's intriguing, is a channel like Republic rates very high in terms of weekly viewing percentage. It's number 4th after Times of India, NDTV, India Today, it's Republic TV over such a short time. And when it comes to trust factor, it's the least trusted. So this is an apparent contradiction. So in other words, you are watching what you least trust. Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying that 48% or 34% who view you don't bother about trust? What are the takeaways?
Maybe Reuters ended up only interviewing liberals.
No, so I think with Republic, I think even people who watch Republic will admit to you that they go there for entertainment. It's a reality TV show, so they probably will not, it's like what's going to happen in this episode of primetime news. So
yeah, but that, Manisha, could be said of almost all mainstream channels, honestly. Republic, I mean, it's become a reality TV show. I mean, it's, how much do you go to it for information? Where is news? I mean, you have the news hour, right? Where you have people fighting with each other. You have a gladiatorial skill on the floor of the studio. So where is news? There's no news bulletin anymore in news channels.
No, my question was more as news consumers perceiving you as not neutral or demanding more neutrality out of you. It does damage us in some ways. Maybe the question is, what do we do as journalists to explain to people what neutrality is, or maybe our tools of journalism? Maybe it's a question of media literacy, explaining to people why journalists function the way they do. Why do they question the governing party more than the opposition? or why do they choose a particular news over any other news? Yeah, please.
Maybe if I may, Manisha.
Yeah.
I think I know it's very hard in practice, and I would certainly struggle with it as well. But I think one of the difficult things that journalists and editors have to try to do is to distinguish between bad faith attempts to weaponize a professional commitment to fairness from broader public perception. And it's incredibly difficult in part because, you get sort of complaints from quite powerful people who sort of go after you in very determined ways, but also just with social media, which many reporters and editors spend a fair amount of time on, you can be very directly attacked and harassed, and you can have various insinuations or much more explicit attacks that question your professional ethics and practices. And that's, very problematic, but it shouldn't be confused with public opinion. I mean, even if there are thousands or tens of thousands of people coming after an individual journalist or newsprint in a country like India, it's a rounding error in terms of the overall population. And it's very hard to keep that in mind if one is at the receiving end of all the abuse. But nonetheless, I think the broader public, my interpretation would be that many people are thinking of what they think of as fairness not so differently from what Supriya described. Fairness, giving everyone a chance to explain their point of view, and also a commitment to, focusing on things that are more important because they involve more powerful individuals or entities. Now, the backdrop, of course, is that while I think some people, perhaps even many people, have individual news outlets that they admire or even trust, and even though, as Dhanya said, we might think that people sometimes trust the media too much, the backdrop here really is quite low expectations often, and relatively, if you will, limited willingness to believe in journalism sort of presentation of self. We don't have similar data from India, but a couple of years ago, we fielded questions where we asked people about whether they feel the news media does a good job of monitoring powerful people and holding them to account. It's only about 4 in 10 who say yes to that question. So if you have a situation where about more than half the public don't believe in the first place that journalists are in fact watchdogs, but more like lapdogs or sort of circus dogs putting on a show, I think if you keep that in mind, it's easier to understand why they may not sort of want a profession in an industry that they, may think highly of a few in, but may not have that high an opinion of most. Why they don't really necessarily think that is that industry's role to take a clearer view or be very partisan or very direct about things, if they fundamentally think that much of journalism is sort of fairly ephemeral and not all that committed to the mission of seeking truth and reporting it or holding power to account, then I think it begins to make more sense why people aren't really buying into the things that we would like journalism to do and that we would like to say that journalism does, and that it does do sometimes, but let's be honest, not always.
Great. Do you want to add anything, Shashi?
Yeah, I buy that, Rasmus. The point is, for instance, take the India report. I mean, the report. On the brand trust rating scale, both Wire and Republic are a fair, more or less, close to one another. I mean, the Wire 50 is among the lowest. Right? The last two in the brand trust, starting with Times of India, the last two are the Wire and the Republic, respectively. So I find that strange. So in other words, what you really have is echo chamber, is filter bubble, phenomenon operating even in the so-called mainstream media. If you're saying that Brand and the Republic are close to each other, are the last two in terms of brand trust out of, say, 15 or 20. Times of India is first, followed by Doordarshan, brand trust, right? Followed by All India Radio, brand trust. Followed by the BBC. The BBC I can believe. Times of India too, I can really, with some stretch believe. But DD and AI are having brand trust for news, which means we are not speaking about news as we understand it. We are speaking about something else.
I think, in fact, we were discussing this before we started. I think with DD and AIR, which is the radio channel, it's a sort of people's longing for news, which is devoid of, all the shouting.
Fireworks. Okay.
So I think people are going there just for their roundup of the day, that here's what happened, and an anchor will just come and pleasantly tell you what happened instead of shouting down at you. So maybe that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of romance for DD, which is owned by the government and which often will not give you the news as it should.
I'm just surprised because I started my career with Doordarshan, spent a good part of my life in Doordarshan News. So I know that nobody believes the news we give them. Not now, not earlier. I mean, it's not peculiar to the BJP in Congress time either. I mean, Doordarshan is a propaganda arm of the government, period.
Yeah.
So if that's what you want, then there's a problem with the understanding or perception of news.
In fact, during the second wave, DD News had nothing on the oxygen shortage that we were facing. We monitored DD for a while and we saw that it was all hunky-dory. But I think it's more a romance and a nostalgia for a simpler kind of a format where an anchor is just pleasantly telling you the roundup of the day. I wanted to go to Supriya next, and please feel free to jump in if you think you want to.
Yeah, so just, Manisha, just to go back to your question, which is what is this doing to our journalism? I mean, we are functioning in a very polarized time where, it can set up very perverse incentives for news outlets to take a position, to privilege one point of view over the other, right? I mean, and I guess that's the challenge really, to still stay steadfast in traditional values. And in that sense, I think, to stick to more reporting and not fall for, what is perhaps a more lucrative, low-cost way of generating opinions. I think that's one of the things that come to mind. And as far as Doordarshan is concerned, I have to confess I haven't watched DD News in a long time. But I wonder if it's also maybe people discount a lot of it. They recognize that it's a national broadcaster. They know the government's imprint on it, and they're perhaps only looking for very basic information, news you can use, like which state has a lockdown in place, are trains running? I mean, perhaps that's the kind of information that they think Doordarshan is reliable for.
Absolutely, because also with the private broadcasters practically don't give you that kind of bulletin, through prime time from 7 to 9. It's mostly just debates. So if you actually want to know the train timing or lockdown things, you will probably have to go to Doordarshan and figure out. But I just want to ask you, since you're leading a newsroom and you've done a fair amount of investigative reporting, especially during the second wave, have you seen a shift in trust in your news consumers? Have you personally felt that there's been more trust towards the kind of journalism that you're doing from your readers or through feedback? Because also often every time Scroll puts out a story, there'll be often a government official saying it's an incorrect story, or there's a fake story, or that this is incorrect, don't fall for misleading information. So how has your experience been with your news readers?
Well, the response has been very heartening. We found that our public accountability journalism has resonated a lot with our readers. Every time we've done an investigative story, it's been widely read, whether last year it was a story on the government's delay in kickstarting production of PPE kits, or this year our report on how the government took 8 long months to invite bids for oxygen plants, which weren't up and running in the second wave, which contributed to those immensely tragic deaths that we saw in hospitals that ran out of oxygen. Each of those stories not only brought readers to the site, but I thought it also sort of signaled or communicated our values in journalism as a small independent newsroom that's seeks to pursue facts that hold power to account. And I felt that readers not only recognized that, readers not only came to us and saw us as a trusted source for it, but also as an expression of how much they valued those stories, they contributed to our ground reporting fund, which was extremely heartening. I felt that in the second wave in particular, where these stories spoke very directly to readers, because this is what they were experiencing at a time when oxygen was running out in hospitals, at a time when people were struggling to get access to hospital beds. Stories that pointed out, government accountability struck a major chord.
Dhanya, what's been the News Minutes experience with the kind of reporting that you've done? Have you seen?
Manisha, I just want to connect your question and Supriya's answer. You had asked that how does neutrality, how does this audience perception that somebody's not neutral and they keep thinking that whatever you report is therefore not correct. How does that impact newsrooms? That was your question. And if I can just link it to Supriya's answer, see, what my understanding through the years is that we live in an echo chamber, whether it's on any social media platform. So we have one group of people who will believe us no matter what, and another group of people who are forever dissing us. Even if it's a factual story, you put a document out, they will still think that's not true. There are two sets of people. Now, it is when something like a COVID-19 second wave happens, and both these groups are impacted by it. Now, they may talk about it or not talk about it, but the point is both these groups are impacted by it. And the second group, which would have always dissed Scroll, said that anything that Scroll does is fake news, suddenly realizes that they are speaking the truth. They are speaking truth on my behalf. And then you see a shift in their attitude. So I think the pandemic definitely has made people realize, especially the people who felt that that all these media houses were biased against the government. They had some dark agenda against the government. Many of those audiences have now realized that, no, look, they are doing journalism, which is important for us because we are the people who eventually suffer if something like this happens again. So I think the pandemic has definitely shifted a lot of thought, and people are starting to think that perhaps news outlets are not always lying and they don't have this deep dark agenda.
Do you have any anecdote to share with us in terms of a feedback or something you found on the ground with your reporters? And
no, not only for my own reporters. I mean, I follow Supriya's tweets. Like whenever she tweets, one of my favorite hobbies is to just go and see the reaction she gets to her tweets. And from that itself, I can understand that people who would have praised the government 4 or 5 months ago, they're starting to believe that, okay, there is another side. We need to listen to the other side. So at least the pandemic has shown to the public that there is a section of the Indian media which cares about public good. And for that public good, they will ask questions to powerful people and the government. And yeah, there are lots of anecdotes, right? Like any story. For example, we've been writing on excess deaths and death underreporting. People, no matter what political allegiance they have or affiliation they have, they do appreciate these stories because it concerns them. Death concerns everyone. People getting hospitalized concerns everyone, no matter what party they belong to, no matter what religion, what caste they belong to. So I think the pandemic will bring that shift, at least some more trust in the media than what was there pre-2020.
Shashi,
if I may actually add here, a measure of that is what we're seeing in terms of the reporting that mainstream media, not known for particularly questioning the government, the kind of reporting that we're seeing there. I mean, Indians across many states felt abandoned in the second wave. Governments were nowhere in sight. And even mainstream media could not ignore the sentiment of their readers and viewers, more than sentiment, the experiences of their readers and viewers. And for that reason, we saw that mainstream media, however feebly or fleetingly, spoke up for their audiences and asked questions.
Absolutely. That's the big difference between the second wave and the first wave, the reporting. Shashi, do you see trust increase? What are the conversations that you're...
I think the digital media, the standalone portals like represented here by Dhanya, Supriya, and others like Wire and Quint and so on. I mean, they are, I think, at the front line of journalism now in India. It doesn't matter, I think, that on the trust scale, etc., or the people, perhaps it's still a new, the new kid on the block, if you like, because in terms of important stories that matter, speaking truth to power, being bold, which is why you can find the government targeting that section particularly. Now, the latest IT rules, it's very clear that the government in the new, what is called intermediary rules, which has been, I think, in passing mentioned in the report as well in the India section. The government is actually, by a sleight of hand, made self-regulation government regulation. They're saying they'll unleash complaints on your portal. If you can't handle it, your body, the insider body should handle it, the industry body. Otherwise, it goes to the government and chaired by a joint secretary, they'll decide whether what you've said is right or what the complainant says is right. If it's a bona fide complainant, it's fine. But the point is, we know the role of trolls now, right? We know how the mob, how the street is being unleashed on the media, and that's going to happen online in a big way. So the digital media are doing a tremendous job. And I think the mainstream media is covering all this, partly, of course, because COVID is too important for anyone to miss. But I think the mainstream media is taking its cues, if I might say so, from a section of the digital media and from the social media. What goes viral on social media, ipso facto becomes material for headline the next day. So they have, I know that in big, mainstream media organizations, they have cells which are monitoring the social media and looking at what's going viral in order to make that the big story of the next day. So I think there's a big shift taking place in that sense in terms of the way journalism is panning out, and I think that's for the better in some ways, whereby you're not just holding the government to account, you're holding the mainstream, the big players, the monopoly media in the country to account, and that's happening by the digital media, and that I think is a big shift in the media ecology.
Newspapers still though continue to be the most trusted or the go-to source for most consumers, and I don't see that changing soon. I do think a lot of people in India are going to go to newspapers, language newspapers and English or Hindi newspapers for their news. But the second wave has also dealt a huge blow to these ad-driven news organizations. We've had corporate advertising shrink, we've had government advertising increase, and that's dangerous because if you're going to be dependent on the government for your advertising, it's going to be, and for your revenue, it's going to be very tough for you to then turn back and question that government. So how do you see this play out in the future?
Yeah, the newspapers are, I think, the major players. Obviously, there are centuries old. I mean, they've been there around for 200 plus years, even in India, right? I mean, it's a very old industry, and therefore it takes that kind of time. The growth of digital portal is the news portal is, I mean, in our own, a decade old. I mean, nothing is not even a decade old in some cases. So it's apples and oranges in some ways. But I think the big story is that this panning out is taking place, and the bigger concern is that the government is cracking down on it the way it is. A very targeted cracking down on the digital portals, which shows you that otherwise they wouldn't bother, right? If it's just some people, barking out there, it shouldn't matter to a government with this kind of majority, with this kind of root majority, but they're really concerned about it. And that, I think, is a big story. But the other big thing, the elephant in the room, I think Rasmus referred to that, the caveat that this is more about the English media, not more, I mean, almost about the English and Hindi media. Yeah. The big story of the media in India is the multilingual, the regional language media. And that's a big growth story. That's growing at a far big, greater pace than the English media growth has plateaued. As we know, Hindi media growth is continuing, but the regional languages are growing at a far higher rate. The rate of growth is tremendous. And therefore, what is happening there is very important. And that, I think, will have to be factored in future studies of India, although it's going to be daunting because you have so many languages and the growth stories trajectories are so different, and the newer and newer readership or viewers or multimedia forms coming into the fold is taking place at such a rapid pace. So I think that's the elephant in the room. That's a big caveat that I think we should underscore and emphasize when looking at this report.
Rasmus, do you want to add anything to everything that we've?
I mean, I think it's important to recognize this, of course, and those opportunities, and also just the incredible complexity and size of India as a media market, in addition to as a society. I'm personally not convinced necessarily that the growth story for regional languages will continue for very long. For the reason that with the sort of the spread of mobile internet access, I think we are seeing both time spent and advertising moving online very quickly in India. And globally, in all the dozens of different countries and markets we do research in, everywhere we see the pattern is the same, which is that sort of regional newspapers that used to dominate regional or local advertising really struggle to adapt to that environment, because the attention, the advertising flows primarily to a few large platforms, often based in the US. People who are willing to pay, and much of the attention focus in news often flow to a limited number of large national brands who expand their digital offerings and can sort of create a virtuous circle financially, at least in that space. And then you have the growth of new entrants, whether they are like Scroll, nationally oriented, or like News Minute, regionally oriented, that are much more lean and much more clearly focused than regional newspapers have often been. And that sort of benefited the other end of this, as difficult as it often is to make ends meet and break even, make immense editorial contributions. So I have to say, I think the sort of the regional and local structure of newspapers in particular will be under tremendous commercial pressure in the years to come. And as several of you have suggested, there are a lot of sort of potential risks with relying on government advertising in that situation, which has its own shortcomings compared to sort of corporate advertising. And of course, we've also seen other forms of corporate influence on the rise in India, where corporations may invest in news organizations, not because they want to support independent professional journalism, but because perhaps they have other motivations. And have wider business interests that may benefit from having or being seen as having the power that comes with controlling important news media. And in that sense, I'm quite concerned about much of the legacy industry, even as I'm very encouraged by some of the very impressive journalism we see from new digital entrants who are standing up to those who want to sort of stop the practice of seeking truth and reporting it.
So I just want to qualify.
I would disagree a bit.
Legacy print media and the regional languages. I was talking about news portals and all of that combined. The Malayalam Manorama, for instance, would perhaps be one of the biggest newspapers in the country in terms of reach, in terms of advertising, tariff rates itself. So I'm talking about in that sense, not in terms of newspapers alone. Just to
no, on Manisha, I want to just disagree with Rasmus and agree with Shashi Kumar, because I think the growth of regional media should not be only about newspapers. Look at television channels in languages like Malayalam, Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, etc. There are many news channels. For example, when the election results were coming on May 2nd or whenever, when the Tamil Nadu, Kerala, and Bengal and all the results came. Now, all these channels have made quick transitions online. They're very active on all social media handles. They are extremely active on YouTube. They are really quick in putting out videos. So, they have adapted themselves very quickly to social media. That's the whole point. And even if you look at an audience, like, for example, let's say a national event is happening and you see streaming on YouTube, you cannot even compare the number of people streaming an English channel to someone who's streaming a Malayalam or a Tamil channel. It's like 10 times more for a Malayalam or Tamil channel, because these channels have quickly adapted. The group which Mr. Shashi spoke about, Malayalam Manorama, I think is one of the front runners in this. They took to digital much before anyone else did. And look at the kind of traffic they drive in, which is also pretty scary, because some of the stuff they put on, some of the stuff that most of these people put, I wouldn't say the same for Tamil and Malayalam, but in Telugu and Kannada can be quite, hyper-national, bigoted, etc. So the influence of the regional media is not much in print, I would say, but it is in television. There are not many independent digital media sites in any of the languages, but definitely these TV channels, the newspapers, and the digital portals have quite a big influence on the population.
Yeah, I mean, if I may add, even in Hindi, not only do we have something like Lalan Top, which is sort of has a footprint across many Hindi-speaking states, but each of the Hindi-speaking states now has an important digital player. Chhattisgarh, for instance, has something called Lallu Ram, I think. So, there's a lot of innovation happening in that space too.
No, and I think the way regional media behaves has a huge impact on the minds of people. I'm not talking just about politics. For example, something like a Me Too movement happens. The Tamil media, for example, except a few people, completely diss the movement. Like, they are disrespectful towards it. They treat it really poorly. So, an entire generation of people sort of believe that. So it's very important how the regional media projects an issue, because a lot of people are vulnerable and they just believe what is being told to them.
Also, Rasmus, the point is, with the success of literacy programs and newer readership, not necessarily the newspaper, but can read text online as well, that growth is really in the different languages, not in the English language, which is why and with the access of smartphones, the mobile revolution in India and so on, that I think is poised for a huge leap.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go to my last question on subscriptions. Rasmus, globally, and of course, specifically in India, let's talk, globally, you told us a bit on your slide, but In India, what is the news consumers' attitude towards subscriptions? Should we be hopeful? What are the kind of insights you got from why people subscribe? And are we getting to a point where people are finally, there is an understanding now that you've got to pay for news if you want quality news?
I think it's probably uniquely challenging in India to make this work, at least in the English language. When you have had, since the liberalization in the 90s, such an influx of advertising that meant that print newspapers were sold essentially for their recycling value and little more than that. And the way in which sort of paid television developed in India was also, in a global perspective, uniquely low prices and uniquely high reliance on advertising. So if you had people who for 30 years, even well before the digital revolution, have been accustomed to thinking of news as a commodity that you picked up for less than the cost of a cup of tea, and that was easily accessible everywhere for virtually for free, it's hard to convince people who have their whole life or half their life had access to things for free. And then it's, of course, compounded by the abundance of news that is available for free at the point of consumption and probably will remain so for the foreseeable future, even if a number of newspapers and digital-born sites were to go beyond hard paywalls. There would be a lot of other English language news available in India. So I think it's very challenging in the particular Indian context. I also have to say, I think it's probably necessary to make it work. And this is sort of not always particularly welcome amongst newspaper executives when I say that, but I have to say that it's very difficult to see things in India going substantially different from what we've seen elsewhere, which is that on the whole and on the balance, if advertisers have a choice between paying for very cheap, targeted, high-reach digital advertising from Google, Facebook, and a number of other large platforms that compete with them, it's hard to see why they would pay a premium for advertising on a news publisher's site. I'm not saying that advertising revenues will completely disappear. I think they will be a significant source of revenue for years to come, but it'll be much smaller than it was in the past. And I think it means that news organizations have to take the risk in many cases to try to convince people to support them in other ways, whether it's commercial and transactional, say, we do things that are worth paying for, you should pay as you'll get something that's better, or whether it's driven by a greater sort of clarity about the purpose of what one is doing in something that goes beyond the transactional value and appeals to people's sort of principles and ideals and saying, well, you should support us because what we do makes a difference in society, even if it doesn't make a difference for you. And even if you could get generic commodified news elsewhere, you should still support us. So I think it's going to be very hard in India, but I also think it's going to be necessary. And I do think that we have to face a situation where the advertising revenues, at least commercial advertising that isn't driven by the sort of desire to influence news media's editorial work, will dwindle and move to California and where they are allowed Chinese-backed or owned platforms of various sorts. Because that's where advertisers get a bigger return on their investment, and they are not in the business of buying advertising to support journalism. They're in the business of advertising to move product. Of course, they're going to spend the money where they think it makes a difference. What's the sort of the upside of this? As said, I really think we need to be clear about how tough this will be, in particular for a lot of sort of mid-sized titles that used to be sort of second largest or third largest in regional local markets or in the English language market nationally. I think the upside of it is that we now know for sure in most of the world that there is a significant minority of people who are willing to pay for news when they can clearly see that it's distinct from generic stuff on the internet, when it's delivered with a product experience that matches what people see from Netflix and Spotify, so a good product as well. And that there are also a significant number of people who are willing to support news in a more principled fashion if news organizations are clear about the value they create, the public value they create, and make an appeal on that basis. I don't think that's going to be a majority, certainly not in India anytime soon. But I think we need to remember also, and this is something I tell journalists and editors everywhere, not just in India, so forgive the Indian example, if you will. that this was the model of journalism for a long time. I mean, when the Hindu was launched, in part to protest, the British occupation and imperialism, colonialism, and whatnot, it wasn't primarily to make money. It was about having a clear identity and editorial stance. And I think that model is coming back, sometimes in ways that we might find quite problematic. They can be extremely partisan, as we've discussed some examples, but also in ways that reminds us that journalism is highly purpose-driven from the point of view of the people who practice it, but also from the point of view of much of the public. And I think there is an opportunity there, also in India.
Supriya, do you want to share Stroll's experience, especially during the second wave when it came to subscriptions? You talked about people supporting a reporting fund. Do you see this as a sustainable model that you'd like to spend on and have less dependence on advertisements? Where do you see this going? Or do you think it's still very nascent for you guys?
So Scroll started subscriptions way back in 2018. At that time, we were asking readers to support our journalism, but we were also offering them an ads-free experience on the site, full access to our archives, even discounts on coffee and books. And over time, we realized that actually what was the strongest driver for a reader to turn into a subscriber was the journalism, the kind of in-depth investigative reporting that we did. And some readers, in fact, got in touch with us and said that the subscription amount was too small, the subscription amount was 1,000 rupees for an annual subscription. And they said that they valued our journalism much more. Well, which is when in the second half of 2019, we came up with the idea of a ground reporting fund. And since then, we've found that readers actually prefer contributing to our reporting fund than buying a subscription. And every time we've broken a major story, we've seen that reader contributions have gone up. Now, I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture because the amounts are still small. They're not substantive enough to cover news gathering costs in a major way, but they aren't insignificant. And I think that's actually cause for some hope that readers do finally recognize the value of journalism and that they're willing to step forward to support newsrooms that they think are doing the kind of journalism they respect.
Great. Dhanya, do you want to come in?
I agree with everything Supriya said, and that's been our experience. We started membership only very recently, which is sometime in the end of 2020, and now we have a reporting project. But it's been the same experience that people, there's a spurt in taking membership because we launched it then, and then of course, more people contribute. There's a spike when there's a story they like, or some story goes viral, or they feel emotionally connected to a story, and people also give a reporting project. But Manisha, I have two concerns, and I'll quickly tell you what the concerns are. First thing, I still believe it's only a small pool of people who are willing to pay for news in India. Whether, like Supriya said, they want to contribute to news because they believe that the journalism that organization does is important, or a group of people who don't mind paying, like the Hindu has a subscription, has a paywall, and they don't mind paying. That small pool has to increase. Now, if that small pool does not increase, first, there's going to be fatigue amongst these people. And I already see people talking that we believe in 10 different outlets, but how many years can we pay all the 10 outlets, like, annual subscription for all the 10 outlets? We can't keep doing that because that's not sustainable for them. Like 1,000 rupees for Scroll, 1,000 for Newslaundry, 1,000 for the News Minute. Many people write to me saying that, why can't you all come together and have some fund and all of us will give and you guys just divide it. So, yeah, so the point is more people have to join this pool where they believe that they have to contribute to news organizations. Otherwise, if that pool does not increase, the fatigue will set.
I just want to come in here because Newslaundry is one of the earliest subscription-driven outlets. We're completely ad-free, and we've had subscriptions since 2014. And the last 2 years for us have been very optimistic because I think somewhere with the pandemic hitting, people have really begun to understand the importance of news that is not influenced by advertisers. But that's come to us now after 2014 because we've done sustained sort of campaigns telling people why a media that's dependent on advertising is not going to serve you. It's not going to serve the public. And if you want, if you want the news to serve you, you have to pay for it. And I think along with that, there's also some media literacy, like I said earlier, to explain to people. I think most people still don't understand why reporting costs money. So simple as that. people don't understand why, if you have to do a story in Uttar Pradesh about, lack of beds in a particular hospital, or say a number of deaths in a particular hospital, people still don't understand why the journalist travels, he stays. Sometimes he or she will come back without a story, so those resources are gone to waste. So I think I'm very optimistic, and I, like Rasmus said, I think there's a significant number of people who want to subscribe, and I think for smaller independent news organizations, it's good enough. Maybe for larger Times of India level, where you have reporters in every district, in every state, it's hard, and it's always going to be a mix of advertising and subscriptions. But smaller independent news outlets, I think it's a question of really, I think, clear messaging. Maybe that's something that helps. So with us, it's just that we're ad free, that we can't exist if you don't support us. So that's simple. But Shashi, do you want to come in about subscriptions for maybe mainstream organizations?
I think I'm optimistic about subscriptions in the long run. I think people will pay eventually if there is value for that. And I think the Hindu paywall is a good example of that. Of course, Hindu is an unfair comparison. But I think they decided to go behind the paywall, and it's working. I'm told that their subscription revenues are ramping up very, very fast, and it's not rosy yet, but it's a kind of optimistic. It could become a revenue model actually. I'm sure that can catch on. But what Dhanya said is important, because you're used to multiple sources of news. Brand loyalty in terms of a channel or a paper, I am not sure exists anymore. At one time people would watch only Doordarshan because it was only acting in town, and then you had, say, NDTV. Now you want to watch this particular news show, even in the news area, this particular aspect of news from this person, this from that channel. You probably look for a particular kind of story in News Minute, another in Scroll, another in Wire, another in print, or another in Quint, and so on. And so this is I hadn't thought of this. That are you then expected to subscribe to all of these? In which case, for an average Indian, that can be quite formidable. So, or is there a newspaper or a media organization which can give you all that you want? There are very few like that anymore, which is ideologically not against what you think. So this is the problem when you have a situation where there's democracy of media, where there's different kinds of media jostling with one another, and experiencing all of them free enables you a wide reach, and enables you then to negotiate your way through all this information, and even try and rubbish the misinformation and disinformation there. If you get into the subscription model, what it does to the media ecology is not still clear to me. I mean, I'm not very sure. The New York Times, as Rasmus pointed out, is made a success of it. The Guardian is, I think, I don't know if they're equally successful. I mean, they request for money or subscription, and yet keep it free. I don't know how successful it is. Maybe Rasmus would know about that. The Guardian model versus the New York Times model.
Do you want to come in, Rasmus, quickly on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just very quickly on that, I think that the New York Times in a way is a sort of a less interesting example, just because it's so unique, and there are so few titles that can reasonably compare themselves to it. But what it illustrates nonetheless is something I think we've seen much more promisingly in smaller markets in Europe, which is that if you are providing distinct quality journalism and you have a good digital product, and you have the courage to ask people to pay for it, either on commercial grounds or on principal grounds, then there is a growing number of titles who are succeeding with that, whether they are legacy newspapers, Dagens Nyheter in Sweden, NRC in the Netherlands, Le Monde in France, many others, or digital-born entrants, Mediapart in France, The Correspondent in the Netherlands, Zetland in Denmark. It's not going to work for everybody, but I think we have a very clear proof of concept now that this is working. The Guardian's decision to take a different route is grounded in their values and their ambition, and it's a brave choice. And they have been far more successful than skeptics, including internal skeptics, had suggested. I think it's clear there are some discussions inside the organization about what the future should be. The CEO just left over such discussions, so clearly, it's not smooth sailing for the Guardian either. They have the benefit of Scott Trust, but more broadly, I mean, while it isn't common across the world, it's worth maybe remembering that purpose-driven news organizations relying on the generosity of their audience is not unique to The Guardian. I mean, the whole public media sector in the US is largely based on that and has been for decades. And of course, I mentioned the sort of anti-colonial newspapers in India, but, in the US too, there are other stories we can draw inspiration from. The Black press, for example, was only in part historically a commercial proposition, but also driven by an appeal to people's values and sense of community and identity, and were, also relied on community support. So, I think there are a range of different models that will work in the future. They won't work for everybody. We are living through a revolution, and revolutions are such that old structures are destroyed faster than new ones are built, or old ones reinvent themselves. It won't work for everybody. I think we have to be clear about that. But in some ways, I'm more optimistic now about the future of journalism editorially, but also as an independent set of institutions that can sort of earn their own lunch than I were a few years ago, even though the challenges remain very severe.
Great. Thank you so much. We're completely out of time. So you can check out the report on RISJ's website. It'll be up now, right, Rasmus? So anyone who wants to do a deep dive into various aspects of the study, do check it out on their website. Do any one of you have any last thoughts to leave us with? Or do you
Just
want
one last mischievous last thought. The report says that politicians are part of the problem. In India, I might add tongue-in-cheek that journalism is part of the problem as well.
Great. Thank you so much, guys, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks all.